Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dana White, and with me today are my panelists, John Booker, Will Lynn, Dara Marks, Kwame Scruggs. And we are in the process of recording the Dennis Slattery talks. What I'm going to do now is turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Will Lynn. And Will, if you would say something about what we're doing, and then we'll go forward from there. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Dana. And thank you, everybody, for being here and continuing with us on this series, really designed for artists, creatives, and individuals who want to develop a more mythopoetic relationship with their own lives, with Dr. Dennis Slattery and our panelists here. John Booker, author of Storytelling for the Virtual Reality and content curator for the Joseph Campbell Foundation. Dara, the author of Inside Story and a very sought after consultant in Hollywood. Kwame, the founder of Alchemy Inc. And of course, Dennis, whose book I'm going to continue to show you guys, really just came out, barely off the presses, in obscure order, which I hope you guys will check out. I think the 276th book by Dennis Slattery. Anyway, tonight we're going to continue where we left off, as we have been doing, moving through this at its own very natural, organic pace. So tonight we'll continue into Mimesis, Neurology, and the aesthetics of presence. And you know, that's really all I have to say to get us started. Excited to dig in this week with Dennis and everybody. And yeah, good to be here tonight.
Thank you, Will. And I always want to express my appreciation to both Dana and Will for having invited me into this series. And then my stalwart, faithful panel, John and Dara and Kwame. It's just a pleasure, and I look forward to this. I look forward to the Myth Salon because it really feeds me at a time when there's a scarcity of good conversation. So two things. I'd like to start with, let me say this to all of you, whether you were here for the third session or not. I'm going to take just a minute or two to recap what we touched on last time, so that if you're new tonight, it'll give you a frame of reference for where I'm going to pick up. And I don't know if your memory is anything like mine. 2 weeks ago is 2 years ago. And it helped me to type this up, this recap, just to get my legs under me for where I want to pick up tonight. So I'll do that in just a minute. But last time, Dana, I think the day after, sent out a sheet in which I posed 3 questions for a writing meditation. If any of you were interested in engaging any one of them, I did. And I will read mine if need be, but it's really, I'm thinking as many ways as I can engage you in this process, so that of course you're an active listener, but there's also a level of engagement where you speak, you pose an idea, you pose something on chat, and maybe you wrote something for tonight. So let me go ahead. And it was just such an interesting error or mistake that I made when I wanted to type the words "my themes." I didn't skip a space, and I looked at the word, and it became mythemes. So the themes that we use as the spine for our master narrative, let's call it, are in fact the myth themes that we live by. So I'm going to share with you some of mine. And I just sat one morning, maybe a week ago, And I asked myself, what themes seem to encourage me, drive me, inflect me in the world today? So here's a small handful. And all of these I could write a paragraph on. But let's call this the outline thematic grid for Dennis Slattery at this point in his life. 1, help others. 2, learn something new every day. 3, keep writing and then share it. 4, forgive myself, even if it needs to happen 10 times a day, and forgive others. I'm not going to count them, I just go. Pray in gratitude. Cultivate friendships. Enjoy solitude. Risk something frequently. Be willing to fail. Learn from it. Listen. Seek balance in every day. Promote in myself sanity and serenity. See the relationships in things, events, people that at first glance seem to be completely different. So I don't know how many that is, and it's not important, but those are, I'm calling them the thematic spines that support my narrative, which is to support my identity of who and what I am.
You know, for me, and we'll keep our eye out for the Q&A and the hands raised. But for me, I actually took the prompt a little bit differently. I saw it as I thought of imagery, you know, and there's a particular image that recurs in my life over and over and over in various ways. That's part of my, you know, workings, and that's that of the volcano. You know, at one point in my life, that image was all about the myth of Sisyphus and that stone erupting into a volcano and changing my metaphor for truth. Then later I'd have a very important dream where I would be made out of obsidian and I would feel, you know, the universe moving through me. And then there was like the magma through the volcano. And then there'd be another dream where I would finally recognize the connection between the myth of Sisyphus and Prometheus, who's the other, such a very important character to me. When I dream, would finally put Prometheus over the top of the volcano where his wound really is where the volcano erupts from. But each one of these was a deeply important thing that I was working with to make sense of my own philosophy and throughout the thread of my life and also in that particular moment. And so I recognize the volcano in these mysterious ways as being a really important theme for me.
That's beautiful, Will. Thank you.
Dennis, I considered this question about us being the author of our own stories and what stories were inherited. And I think my mind first went to the place of what negative stories, you know, has someone given me that I've you know, continued to take.
Yeah.
But after thinking about that for a few moments, I was struck that I was actually given some very positive stories that have deeply impacted my life on a daily basis. When I was young, my father told me, be reading part of a book every day. Be reading every single day. And to this day, I read, you know, part of, I read some of a book every day. And, you know, that is an inherited story that has become authentically mine after receiving it. So I think sometimes, you know, as I was reading that prompt and I was thinking about it, how it applied my own life, I was thinking, you know, sometimes these inherited stories actually become authentic to us through the practice and the experience, and they become just as precious as if it was something that had sprung up in our own psyche.
Yeah, yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you, John.
I think there are a couple things that you said, Dennis. I like what, by the way, John, that was terrific too. Thank you. A couple things I would sort of amplify that have become real important to me. When I was young, you know, I would try anything. It was like young people do. And I kept finding the older I got, the more cautious I kept becoming. And this idea of risk, I think is really critical in my life, and push myself out of my comfort zone. I mean, try and do something on a daily basis that is I mean, even if it's as simple as walking, you know, I go for walks every day, walk in a direction I haven't gone before or something, because it's so easy to become complacent. And also the other thing you said about be willing to fail, I think that is so critical. I was once listening to a talk, and a woman was saying that her father used to greet everyone at the dinner table and say, "Tell me what you failed at today." And he really wanted to know, because that meant you tried. That meant you were pushing the envelope. And she became a very successful woman because she wasn't afraid to fail, and to keep trying. And so that's another one that is very important. And then the other one for me is the older I get, I mean, I know this sounds like a cliche, but the more I become more and more conscious of how, that I really don't know anything, that I have a lot of assumptions, but the more I'm willing to allow my assumptions to be challenged and to be open every day, that the way I think it is may not be, you know, and so that's another one that is really important for me, that I try, I'm not always successful, but I do try to at least remain open to the possibility that I don't know anything. You know, I can only estimate where I am right now.
Yeah, there we go.
We're going to let Mike talk. Mike Setkamp.
Mike, please.
Dana. Hi, Dennis.
Hi. Hi, Mike.
So especially now with the picking of a new vice presidential candidate, I've been noticing, maybe similar to what Dara is noticing, that I really don't know what justice is. And so I think a theme for me is to keep discerning justice, and to not be hurt when the folks who I hope to work for aren't getting what I think justice is. And then, so I also wrote down forgive injustice and move on. And I wrote down trying to think as far into the future as I can for so many kids. I work with the disability community to give my heart to the 7th generation and to today's. And in the interest of some self-care, get a good night's sleep and dream.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Beautiful. Let me recap what we covered last time, just to bring it back into the room. And then for Michelle and any others that came in a few minutes after we started, I'm going to continue on this Mimesis, Neurology, and the Aesthetics of Presence that we were working on last time. There's several pieces that I never got to, and I'd like to present them tonight. And then the 5th class will be on maybe the mythopoetics of reading, the act of reading. And, you know, whether you set up a ritual before you read, and not read everything, but when you move into deep reading, and we'll talk about what that is. So that'll be the 5th class. So here's what I typed up this morning as I look back over the presentation. We entertain the idea or the nature of psychopoetics. We looked at the nature of analogy as a psychological principle and even a form of a methodology. I offered a concrete example of my wife and I sitting on our front deck in the silence of an encroaching evening. I made the suggestion of how beautiful this moment was and was instantly flooded with a memory of a scene in Moby Dick in which Ishmael feels a melting in him, sitting by his newly discovered friend, Queequeg. That allowed us to see the power and presence of correspondence, which seems so much a part of myths generally. Then we touched on James Joyce's term, aesthetic arrest, that Campbell used often. He loved that term. And Campbell used it to convey a sense of being overtaken by an effect, and this is Campbell's language, I lifted it and I wanted to share it, by an effective mythological symbol in embodied form. Then we touched on Nancy Mellon's explorations in her Body Eloquence book and looked at particular stories' ability to heal the body. There's something potent in metaphors themselves, which are the bedrock of stories. And then we touched on Jung's observation that one can fall out of an archetypal situation which gives their lives a right attitude. In other words, we can fall out of a right attitude that supports and encourages and nurtures us. And then I related the story that Jung relates of a man who was bitten by a snake and has a story related to him of Isis, the wife of Ra, who placed a sand viper in her husband's path, just under the sand. And he stepped on it and was bitten. Now the snake-bitten man listens to this story and it becomes part of his healing. And then the last thing that I'll mention that we brought up that seemed to be important, how story reveals the power of mimesis, which is where I'd like to begin this evening, and further explore the relationship of mimesis and myth in their intimate relationship. It's my sense, and I can't prove it, but I'm having fun exploring it and want to engage you further in the exploration, that when Aristotle writes of mimesis in the Poetics, I think he's touching on the origin of myths themselves. In other words, I think that myths are originarily mimetic. In other words, they're the expression of a correspondence between the inner and outer worlds we live in, but also they ferret out possibilities of affiliations which we normally would never think about as interrelated. So it's in that field, if I can refer to it that way, that I want to pick up tonight and just muse with me on what might possibly be arcing towards some kind of insight about the origin of myths themselves. That's what I'm after pursuing a bit further. So I'm going to pick right up from where I was last week. Writing on Plato's understanding of mimesis in the Timaeus, one of the best readers of Aristotle, Stephen Halliwell, reveals that this Socratic dialogue suggests mimesis is a key to the structure of the world. What a pronouncement. Mimesis is a key to the structure of the world and of reality itself. which is to be comprehended in terms of correspondences and interrelations between mimetic objects and mimetic subjects. That's Halliwell's language. More deeply, he senses that mimesis suggests, quote, everything created is a correspondence to what is invisible, a higher order or paradigm of existence. So myths often bridge what might seem a chasm between the interior world in which we're telling ourselves stories all the time and the external reality that we move through. And I think myths give us a compass by which to negotiate or navigate both of those worlds at the same time. The motion then of psychopoetics includes a synthesis or a constellation of the visible and invisible realms that narratives themselves have the capacity to unite and to make or shape our lives' past events into formed and coherent experiences. So I'm fascinated by how events that we happen to or that happen to us are turned into meaningful experience by means of narratives, and what myth may underline a narrative to give it its shape, and to integrate those two realities, one more attuned to the facts of our past and the other to the mythopoetic truth of our histories. Because I don't think that what has happened to us in the past is historical until we give it a narrative. Just consider that. The nature then of storytelling or story crafting includes a persuasive narrative structure that creates a likeness and as if quality to assist one in regaining a rightful place within an archetypal constant that reorders one's life. I believe this reordering or reorganizing principle is the substance of myth. Moreover, in his commentary on Aristotle's Poetics, see, I'm enjoying pulling ancient Greek thought into a modern discussion of narrative to grasp something fundamental about the nature of myths themselves. So the writer of the Poetics, or the interpreter of the Poetics, O.B. Hardison, reminds us that poetry originates in two natural causes: our proneness to imitate and our delight in harmony and rhythm. I mean, when you think of how many people wear the number of a jersey of a favorite athlete or a famous rock band or a famous singer, there's mimesis taking place in that fashion statement, if you will. The desire to imitate, even if it's to wear the face of Michael Jordan on a t-shirt. Hardison observes that Aristotle refers to the fact that imitative works, if they are well done, and this is where I think aesthetics enters in that language, reveal generic qualities, the presence of the universal in the particular, and that the spectator or audience learns from this. Well, that's the language of archetypes and the language of depth psychology that's infused in that presence of the universal, in the particular. What he calls universal seems analogous to the archetypal situation Jung described earlier. which emerges or gains visibility through the particulars. In the case above of the snake bite treated with the narrative of Ra's viper. A healing poetic venom, so to say, that may hurt in the hearing, but which realigns the man bitten in a curative way. And just as a sidebar, and I know many of you are aware of this, but when Bill W. and Dr. Bob, the originators of Alcoholics Anonymous in the 30s in Akron, Ohio, realized that they had a much better chance of staying sober in the community of the two of them than if they would tough it out on their own. So one of their medicinal strategies was to visit local hospitals in Akron, and they would go to the nurses station. They would say, you know, we know you have people drying out in here. Can you point us to the room that holds the most alcohol poisoned person in here? Oh, no problem. It's room 36. They know immediately. So Bill W. and Dr. Bob would head down there, and if the person was awake and conscious and welcoming at any level, they would ask the person, what are you going to do when you get out of here? And if the response was, well, I'm going to put on a bender even greater than the one I've been at, and they said, God bless you, man, good luck, and they'd leave. But when they came to a room in which somebody said, I'm never going to have another drink, and they congratulated that aspiration, and they said, well, that's admirable, but do you think you could not have a drink for tomorrow? Oh, tomorrow, one day, easy. Great. Would you like to hear us tell you our stories? In other words, when they felt here was someone receptive to their narratives, which took them down to the bottom of hell, and they, by miracle, by grace, climbed back out. Then they felt this is somebody who could benefit by hearing his, usually his, story modulated through their stories. That was mimesis. The origin of the recovery programs, from my vantage point, rests on mimesis. You tell me the plot of your story, and I will feel its action in my imagination and in my soul. In the story, then, is a healing or a right ordering, a mimesis that is medicinal and metaphoric. In short, an analogy of the man's snake bite, now in mythopoetic form. I'd suggest further that imitation contains a calculus of inspiration. By means of it, some curative energy is released to bring one back into right relationship through what I'm going to call an imaginal way of knowing, by way of the power of narrative presence. If Campbell is accurate in calling metaphor, quote, the native tongue of myth, and that's in Thou Art That, page 8. Metaphor is the native tongue of myth. Then this rhetorical and mythopoeic figure, in its expression of a relationship of two unlike things via their likeness, carries within its structure a healing component. That's a mystery to me. And I love any responses. I'll pause in just a couple of minutes. I want to push on a little bit. But if anything occurs to you, how that is possible, that is, in its expression of a relationship of two unlike things via their likeness, that carries within its structure, I'm suggesting, a healing component. In his fine study of poetic knowledge, James Taylor, not the singer, although he has his own poetic knowing, as we know from listening to him over the last 35 years, he reveals how for Plato and Aristotle, music, both in its rhythms and harmonies of song and lyre, as well as in the rhythm and harmony of words, must be one of the essentials of learning, because it offers to its audience both pleasure and beauty. For this discussion, moreover, here's the important piece that he adds. In the process of education, writes Taylor, and this is a quote, a direct appeal to the sensory emotional life of the human being is held to be necessary and essential knowledge. That is, I'm going to read it again, a direct appeal to the sensory emotional life of the human being, not just to the intellect, is held to be necessary and essential knowledge. So there is a kind of somatic gnosis where we know by our senses. He then cites directly from Aristotle's Poetics. All men, and that's the language of the day, all men by nature desire to know. An indication of this is the delight we take in our senses. We do not regard any of the senses as wisdom. Yet surely these give the most authoritative knowledge of particulars. That's Aristotle in the Poetics. When we recall Jung's story of the man bitten by a snake, it seems clear that to bring his now wounded nature back into alignment with his original archetypal situation that rightly orders both body and soul in its instinctive nature. And we can recognize how narrative is an efficacious pathway to healing. In addition, it is not just the content of the story, but its aesthetic ordering that reclaims order and balance. And I think that aesthetic ordering is where beauty appears in narratives. When Taylor quotes Socrates' famous insight, here's Socrates, the object of education is to teach us to love what is beautiful, end of quote. It includes, as Taylor goes on, the beauty of right judgments, the delight in good dispositions and noble actions, and the pleasures of virtue itself, all of which form the container for ancient education. I understand in his observation and in Socrates' insight a parallel or analogy to Jung's sense of, and I'm quoting Jung again, the right instinctive attitude that comprises inhabiting an archetypal situation. This right instinctive attitude, Taylor claims, this just right is poetic knowledge. In other words, when something is fitting, when it's a right fit, when something feels fitting to do or to say, that all implicates aesthesis, which I'll speak about in just a couple of minutes. And it is also a way of speaking about poetic knowing, the judgment of the senses, without which all higher learning, Taylor claims, tends to become dehumanized and increasingly destructive. When that sense of poiesis drops out of the act of learning, then I think we get data processing and information information overload. Aesthesis includes a shining forth or a showing of itself in its appearance. And James Hillman, for my money, is one of the most eloquent writers on aesthesis. Aesthesis carries the sense of exposition, exposure, and expression. It's a moment of both anticipation and fulfillment. Aesthesis engages a noticing and a being noticed by. All of that is working, I think, in every day when we choose the clothes that we're going to wear to be noticed out in the world. And to maybe feel fitting and in the right instinctive attitude. Its simple design reflects its complex grandeur, aesthesis. It's an instant of a sudden making, which is the original sense of the word poesis. We've mentioned that, but I thought wouldn't hurt to bring it back up. Poesis is about a making or shaping something into a form that can be shared, as was the story of Ra available for healing the snake-bitten man earlier, which was a poetic move into sunlight and public view that reveals good intentions and silences desires that consume one in the fires of one's own cravings. Campbell sheds light on this process when he writes the following. And what the myth does is to provide a field in which you can locate yourself. And I don't think that's unlike the field that I feel now in making this presentation. I feel the start or the construction of a field, an archetypal field, in which the content of this presentation finds its context. I think it happens when we see a film, when we engage in good conversation, a field begins to arise. Stories then would seem to help us either in the crafting or the hearing or the reading, and then in recollecting them to recreate a field in which our identities may be given back to us on a fuller, richer level than our awareness had heretofore been capable of. Hillman writes beautifully about aesthetics. Quote, what the Greeks called aesthesis, which is the way that the world gets to us through sense perception. In The Health of a City's Soul Life, Hillman links aesthetics to ethics, which we will see shortly is close to another writer's sense of beauty and of justice. And I was thinking of Michael's observation that he made when we began. The connection of beauty to justice itself. So that aesthetics is not decoration or an add-on or a filler after the functions of a thing have been satisfied. Then we turn to ideas of beauty. We turn to art classes and music classes, which are often the first to be sacrificed in budget cuts in school systems. No, it's more primal and imaginal than that, and it is necessary for the survival of the soul life of both citizens and communities. And then of my 3 C's, consciousness, conscience, and even commerce. Aesthetics is necessary for all of those. A few years ago, I gave a talk to a Friends of Jung group in a southern state. My topic was pilgrimage as soul journey, a subject I developed in a published book describing a lengthy pilgrimage of my own, which initially was entitled Grace in the Desert, and then I revised it to A Pilgrimage Beyond Belief. After the presentation, as often happens, a member of the audience, on this occasion, a woman dressed in a rainbow of bright colors, approached me. No sooner did she begin telling me why she decided to attend the talk than she began to weep. When I asked what had upset her, she related to me without any hesitation that her cat of 19 years had died a year ago, the weekend of my presentation. I was presenting on a Saturday night, and her cat had died the following day, Sunday, 1 year previously. And it was her only family. And now she was about to complete her first year living alone. And the anguish on her face was so powerful. The anniversary was too much for her, and she wanted to share her loss, her grief, and this important anniversary with me, a complete stranger. I was both moved and honored. I did what I could to comfort her. I told her my wife and I had enjoyed the company of several of our own pet cats for all the years of our marriage. I told her I would be thinking about her and her beloved pet the next day, Sunday. That night, I dreamed of this woman in her bright, multicolored regalia, of her loss and her willingness to share such an intimate part of her life with me, a complete stranger. In the morning, the lines began to assemble themselves into the following poem, which I titled, Orange is the Color of the Grieving Wound. Now I'm going to risk something. I'm going to read it aloud to you. She did not look silly, not at her age, wrapped in the colors of fall, yellow straw hat, orange shawl, the lightness of filigree, a red blouse, and lips the color of a maple leaf along a road in Vermont. She asked of tattoos and what stories might be snagged in the skin of stains of a riot of ink. She, a tattoo herself, a bright flare against a drab horizon. I liked her spunk, alone, unafraid, in the crowd of far younger folk wearing shadows of clothes, absent any light from within, until her face changed, grew dark and far away, just an instant before tears began to bleed the yellows and orange and reds into a fine and thick commotion of grief. I have such deep wounds in my heart, she wept. My cat, my only family for 19 years, died last year this Sunday. What am I to do? Her question had the gravity of 1,000 leaves zigzagging down from the great tree of life all at once. Buried in the branch of decay, I could not answer. She wept, and I faced the wounds in her heart, now visible, beginning to speak, beginning to purr in a ritual chorus of hardwood and stones. The air grew cold between us. I saw just above her yellow hat a sun setting on her 70 years. a blue norther of approaching winter snows. Her grief grew bright orange until I could no longer see her. There, falling in front of me, my legs rooted in the soil of her loss. Now, the impact of her grief and loss was too powerful to disremember. It needed a formed receptacle for me to contain it, to fix it in words, so it would not be forgotten. My talk struck something in her, if even only the time of the year I presented it, to discharge the grief she felt. I, in turn, moved by her memory and her dread of spending the first year's anniversary weekend alone, marking her pet's passing, felt both her grief and her loneliness as my own. The rhythm of her grief had struck a congruent chord in the cadences of my own losses, beloved pets included. Together, we created a community of loss, of expectation, of anticipation, and even of annihilation. Her loss and my awareness of it now felt deeply, found common soil in the poem. Writing of her experience for myself, I felt a healing, a closing of a wound, and a strong presence of compassion for the suffering of another. It insisted, moreover, on public expression of an internal condition, a right, R-I-G-H-T, even a right, R-I-T-E, ordering. In this moment of learning and leaning into her grief, that was essential. It was non-negotiable. She had dressed the part, had made the weekend into a celebration and a dirge in dress that recalled her pet, and then offered it to me as a gift as we stood by the podium. I wrote the poem in part to commemorate that moment, the agony of her anticipation of a lonely anniversary and her party-colored clothes that remembered the joy of so many years together with her family member, whose passing was akin to an affliction, opening up before me like a flower blooming in winter. So I'm going to pause there, because then I shift here. But yeah, I want to pause and allow and invite or encourage any observations. You don't have to pose a question, you can, but any observation. Because as I said earlier, I've never presented this essay before, so I don't have much in the way of responses to it. So it's as important for me to hear you as it is for you to speak.
Okay. Well, you know, I was just gonna say, I had a great conversation with Christophe Lemuel one time, and I brought up a dream that I had earlier in this session that actually was a dream I had the night after one of our conversations, where he made a certain point that seems very relevant right now. And that was that the mind, when it makes analogies, it often leaves them apart. This is like this, and they almost exist in a kind of, even analogy has a subject-object relationship built into it. But his point was that the unconscious can mix these analogies into a new combination where it's not just an either a subject-object relation. And I think that's happens with projection. I project into that thing, and now that subject-object relationship disappears around the mimetic quality that we share.
Yeah.
And I just thought, I just hope you'd go with me there intellectually, for a second about how, these moments can be when all these analogical recurring mimetic patterns, the subject object of it disappears, fades away, and then we're in this moment of deeply feeling it.
Yes. So out of that diversity of the subject object can grow this unity that collapses that, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I just think it's so like we talk about this very intellectually, but it really isn't until the poem, or until the moment, until it gets out of the mind that the true potential of that analogy becomes an energy.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Others.
Yeah, I was really moved by talking about myths as a container.
Yes.
A container for really, really deep emotions. Very, very briefly, years ago, cared for this person, great deal, cheated on me, blah, 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 blah. And I had kind of just come back from a workshop where I saw Jean Shinoda Bolen talk about suffering in the search for meaning. And she talked about the story of Inanna, traveling down to the underworld for Ereshkigal. And I can't tell you how relevant that story was for giving me that container, that framework, to a place to process all those really deep emotions, because I really felt very much like Ereshkigal, let me tell you, filled with rage and depressed all at the same time. And then maybe also in a sense, because myth is a story, like it might be a story of psychological relevance or meaning, but because it's a story, it also has an ending. And so perhaps inherent in the myth is the possibility to be able to come back from being in such a dark place.
Very fine. Thanks, Michelle, for that. Others.
We have a couple people in the participant gallery that I think do want to come in, but echoing on what you were saying, it seems to me that the entire Platonic dialogues were about pulling the content of the unconscious and the archetypes and the substance, as Plato wrote in the Meno, about pulling it out of the person. We don't discover it in the external world, that those archetypes are contained within us.
Yes.
And as Blake wrote, you see the universe in a grain of sand, which is to say that the universe is contained within the particular. And I think that's what you were saying there, that, and our goal is to serve as our own miner, if you will, to go into the deepest recesses of the self and find these universals, these archetypes, these myths that are stirring up within us.
Yes. Yes, and Socrates was the first to say, he said, I don't know much, but what I see myself being is a midwife to you. And I can't remember the dialogue that is named after the student that he takes on. He says, I'm just a midwife. And so I'll pose some questions to you, but to Dana, to your point, it was to educate, to pull out from the inside into the world. And now it can be worked with on a different plane. But yeah, please, others,
All right.
love to hear your thoughts.
This may take me a second. I'm going to let Skylar come in.
Okay. So I'd like to talk about the role of emotion in creating this narrative transport, which is a term that Melanie Green developed, but it roots really back to Aristotle. And I'm reading from his book right now about tragedy as an imitation of an action. And then I'm going to just skip on a little bit, of a certain magnitude. in language, but in the form of action, not narrative. And here's the key thing: through pity and fear, affecting the proper purgation of these emotions, or cleansing of the emotions. So it's through pity or empathy with what is going on in the story, and fear, because we're empathizing now. And depending on how the story is told, creates this cleansing of emotions. And it's
Yes.
really this whole thing is affected through the role of emotion.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful. And you know, one of the great of many inventions of the Greeks, as I've read, is a dramatic action played out on a stage with live figures, so that the audience can have that sensate experience playing out in front of them and bringing up those emotions that you just named, and experience some kind of catharsis, which I understand is a kind of a healing modality.
Exactly.
So beautiful that you bring
Cleansing.
that in, a cleansing. That's I think that's even better.
Cleansing,
Cleansing.
catharsis. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Nice, Skylar. Thank you for that.
You know, not to put anyone on the spot, but Dara, this is just a conversation I feel like I've had with you so many times about healing art and about people like really providing stories that can help people grow. I'm really curious what you're thinking about over there.
Again, I have a page full of notes here. There are several things that you brought up, Dennis, that I just want to sort of mirror back and kind of see it, you know, again from a certain perspective.
Beautiful.
You know,
good.
You know, in terms of mythopoetics, the mythopoetic stature of where we are in the world today, you said a couple things that I want to sort of like look at from another position. I mean, my personal view is that the world only arcs towards higher consciousness. It doesn't, you know, we can go through a regressive patch, but you can't undo what has become conscious. You know, you can relate to it in a regressive way. And you were describing poesis in terms of a field in which you can locate yourself, and a field in which our identities can be given, reflected back to us. Okay, and I was thinking about this whole era we've been going through in the last 4 years with Trump, and how we could apply that concept to a lot of people who have bought into a narrative and that defines them, you know, in terms of locating themselves and so on. Something under, I mean, he is, he makes narrative that people can buy into, all right? And so I was just thinking in terms of, you use the term midwife, and I often use that myself in terms of what our obligation kind of is to the world in terms of consciousness, that it's very important that we do the kind of work we're doing, because we need consciousness to sort of midwife, what is coming, what is coming at us. Because otherwise we remain reactive, okay, and that there has to be some among us who can kind of see things for what it is, or at least have a glimpse of it, to sort of midwife it. And if we leave this era of Trump behind without kind of acknowledging the dark inner world that somehow people are relating to, I think we're covering it over, then, I mean, to me, transformation means confrontation with shadow. You have to, because you aren't transformed just because you say so, because you have a greater idea, because something new in consciousness has broken through for you. You have to confront the inner elements that hold you in place before you can move into the next thing, whatever that is. So I'm not sure quite how to frame a question, but I don't want to talk about mythopoesis as if it's only moving into some elegant, beautiful field of greater consciousness where we only see things of beauty, because I think we're missing then its full nature, because it can reflect back to us our darkest nature as well, and we have to be able to see that.
Yes.
I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, you're making complete sense. You know,
Yeah.
step 4 of the 12-step recovery program is to make a fierce and fearless inventory
Right.
of the best parts of ourselves, which writers on the 12 steps say is for most people much more difficult to admit the nobility of themselves than the shadow material, which they go to and write pages on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm completely in agreement with you that to sidestep or deflect that is to risk the danger of slipping back into the way it was, which is for me a death trap and an impossibility.
Well, I think we have an undeniable urge to move forward, but to leave aspects of ourselves behind and keep it buried doesn't give us a platform to really a greater discovery of the self, because we're not making a relationship with all aspects of ourself. Only
Yes.
the stuff we think is good and likable and resides in the on the surface of the world.
Yeah. And it's to invite that shadow back when we think, well, we're glad we have that behind us, and then hang on to your nippers, because the shadow is around the corner. Now, as soon as the guard is down, up it comes. I mean, the shadow has an intellect, a consciousness, and a cleverness that's remarkable.
Where's Connie when we need her?
Yes. Yes.
So we do. Kate is out there, and I'd like to unmute her and allow her to talk.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you
There
so
we
much.
are.
Hi, Dennis.
Hi, Kate.
Hi. Wanting to make some links on mimesis and this idea of mimesis as a form of psychic movement, and doing my work on Inanna in the underworld. I've been reading some Hillman on the dream in the underworld, and in his book I came across this quote that I thought might work in this idea of mimesis and this movement, this psychic movement. I'd like to read it to kind of link some things together, maybe.
Please.
As the psyche moves toward the underworld, which is a perspective and not necessarily actual death, there develops an even stronger feeling of sameness, for sameness, an identity of opposites where the cure is the disease, the healing is a deeper wounding, and the newborn infant is death. One cannot distinguish here from there. There is only the image. And I just was thinking about this idea of how in the psychic movement that mimesis is this alchemical process of moving us in a way to death, but new life. And in the story of Inanna that was brought up earlier, it's a mimetic moment, right? When the two little demons, if you will, sent by Enki into the underworld to bring the water and the plant life for Inanna. She's dead, or yeah, she's dead at this point. But they mimic Ereshkigal in her pain and in her emotional moaning and groaning. And it's that massaging of these two creatures that softens Ereshkigal to, in a sense, kills her moment to open her up to this new relationship with Inanna and the upper world. And so I just wanted to bring that into this idea of massaging, mimesis as massage and movement of psyche towards death, but in it, that healing and that wholeness emerging.
Yeah, beautiful, Kate. That's a wonderful analogy, a rich analogy. Mimesis as massage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Let's go to Sheila.
The word mythobiogenesis was coined by Bonaduce, and thank you, John, for putting the mythologium in the chat, because I never would have known about his dissertation if you hadn't.
Great.
But I wrote a poem, the mythobiogenesis, the somatics of co-making being, requires unlearning atom, A-T-O-M, and Eve proceedings. And the earlier question about what is the idea, or what's on your grid? My grid, you know, Dennis, has been the labyrinth for at least 5 years now.
No.
And I'm hearing, and I'm a birth psychology, what's going on in the psyche of the preborn educator. So I'm hearing so much natalistic language in tonight's lecture. And let me just take you through 4 steps that I heard using your language, Dennis, of conception, implantation, forming a heart, and forming a body, which each have wayfinding behaviors to them.
Mm-hmm.
So you said earlier, fall out of right attitude. When the egg and the sperm, and I'm doing this because these are, I believe, like Bonaduce does, that we're getting our myths from lived experiences.
Oh, yeah.
So falls out of right attitude would equal the fall into the womb. My legs rooted in her loss, that would be implantation. Moved by her memory, emotion and empathy would be the forming of the heart. And I need a formed container, and that would be embodiment. So in your language, you're finding the universal that we all go through, that is common origin story for all of us, and the particulars of listening to that woman. And somebody just mentioned, and I don't know her, I can't remember her name, just a midwife. Oh no, it was you, Dennis, just a midwife to pull out from the inside into the world. I mean, this is all natalism, which I sent an article to Bonaduce. He just texted and emailed me today and said, I'm reading this. I never thought about these things before.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
No, thank you. See, this is this is why, I mean, all of your comments and is the essential reason that I wanted to present this exploration, because the analogies that so many of you have drawn and others have drawn but haven't spoken, that's fine too, is really where the juice is. I mean, that's where for me, that's where the real learning is. So I can't appreciate you all enough. And for your willing to risk speaking what's cooking in you over this. And here's a section entitled Neuroscience and Mere Neurons. In working with the Oedipus story of Sophocles in his Poetics, and oh gosh, I can't remember, one of you just brought this up, so you're going to hear some echoes of what she brought up from the Poetics. In the Poetics, Aristotle discovered what he called mimesis, an imitation of a poetic action that's shared by the readers or viewers, which leads them to a deeper insight on human behavior and its motives. Mimesis is a dramatic psychology. As such, it allows for what Jung described as a right instinctive attitude that Sheila just took us back to, a pathway to individuation. Neuroscience, and believe me, I have not read enough of, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but this little brush with neuroscience I wanted to add. Neuroscience suggests that such an imaginative act is possible by what it designates as mere neurons. While its complexity admits of only a short mention here, I do believe it is worth acknowledging the work of this provocative field, which is still fairly new, especially neurobiology, and specifically the work of Daniel Siegel on mindfulness, meditation, and resonance with the world through specific areas of the brain. So his book, which I pulled off the shelf, and I'll just hold it up for just a moment. This is, and I've not read all of it. It's slow going because he's so provocative. So I just want to let you see that one that is more than a primer for neuroscience, but a fabulous book, and I'm finding I can comprehend it.
Yeah, Dennis, just to joke
yes.
with you, it's so new. The mirror neuron stuff that I actually got kicked out of my neuroscience class in college for bringing it up because the teacher thought I was being cheeky for saying, "Hey, how about mirror neurons and autism?" So it's super new stuff, but for those of us in the archetypal field, mirror neurons is one of the most exciting discoveries, developments, and anyway, I just thought I'd share that.
No, perfect. Thank you for that. It's a backdrop for what I'm going to present here. My intention is not to reduce either Aristotle or Jung to a scientific analysis, but rather to explore analogies between Siegel's discoveries that pertain to the discussion thus far as a way to further delineate how I believe the creative imagination works in the psyche. In his popular book, The Mindful Brain, Siegel outlines the nature and structure of mirror neurons, which, among other duties, allow us to become aware of awareness itself, as well as attend to intention that he outlines in Appendix 3 in a section by the same name. Neuroscience has fast become the new mythology of science, a supplemental religion to our current mythology. Its shadow side is that it can easily reduce experience's complexity to a causal and simplistic explanation, which is far from my intention in bringing it up or in this presentation generally. Having said that, what Siegel and others label our, quote, social brain is a mirror neuron system. part of its workings allows each of us to, quote, and this is Siegel, perceive the intentional, goal-directed actions of others and link this perception to the priming of the motor systems to engage in that same action. That's a neurobiological description of mimesis. We, in effect, prepare to mirror in our own actions the behavior of others as one effective way to gain mindfulness towards them by attuning ourselves to their behavior. In the act of mirroring the other, we attune ourselves more cogently and directly with the other, and in an imaginal way become the other. What Campbell, borrowing from the rich Hindu tradition, calls tat tvam asi, thou art that. Transforming religious metaphors is the subtitle of Thou Art That, a full volume by Campbell that I bet many of you know. It's one of my favorites in all of his writings. Now, I use this analogy only in a limited sense to suggest that some underlying unity of all things is at play in our ability to sense in the other a reflection of our own nature and identity. It is as if I am the other. Siegel labels this action the building of what he calls a resonance circuit, which, his language now, directly involves the mirror neurons, that promotes or fosters, quote, imitative action, end of quote, through the developed neural and affective condition of resonance. I hesitate to call his discovery a physiological mimesis, yet as Stephen Halliwell observes, the classical notion of mimesis described a number of types of correspondence. Halliwell goes on to discuss how Aristotle's guiding principle of mimesis is of enactment. It's acted out. It's performed. Both enactment and narrative are two modes of mimesis. Mirror neurons seem to be inflected most emphatically in enactment. My poem above, based on the woman's grieving, is closer, I think, to a narrative form of mimesis. I'm interested in neuroscience's discoveries only to the extent that it offers an analogy or a relationship to the way imagination is always seeking and discovering cogent connections between experience and image to create an organized world, an organized world view we each require, I think, to move through our everyday lives. To return to Siegel, he then cites two other neuroscientists working on how we're able to empathize with others, and maybe most importantly, with ourselves. Quote, empathy is not a simple resonance of affect between the self and others. It involves an explicit representation of the subjectivity of the other. Such a condition implicates the neural activity of the, see if I can read this, quote, the ventral prefrontal cortex with its strong connections with the limbic system, dorsolateral and medial prefrontal areas. And that's Siegel. Now, most fascinating for me in his discussion in Appendix 3 is the work of two other researchers, Slattery and Chaminade, who have discovered that in neuroimaging, and I want to read their finding or their discovery, that in neuroimaging, studies strongly support the view that during the observation of actions produced by other individuals and during the imagination of one's own actions, which they put in italics, there is a specific recruitment of the neural structures which would normally be involved in the actual generation of the same actions. Such a mechanism would prompt the observer, and what I'm going to read now is in italics, to resonate with the state of another individual, with the observer activating the motor representations that gave rise to the observed stimulus. Now I know that's a lot, but let me just break it down a little bit. In reference to the above quote, my interest is in the italicized line, the imagination of one's actions. For the psyche speaks through the language of image, metaphor, symbol, figure. And you could add to that, I'm sure. The poem I wrote as a reply to being with the woman whose pet had died was a mimetic response to being in her grief with her the evening before. And now I'm going to cite what was already cited, and this will underscore what one of you read from the Poetics a little while ago. In his Poetics, Aristotle called it pity, along with fear, but we might want to shift it and call it compassion or empathy, which you did when you read it. He writes, for the plot ought to be so constructed that even without the aid of the eye, he who hears the tale told will thrill with horror and melt to pity at what takes place. I would concentrate on his observation that the plot ought to be so constructed. You can't tell a story any old way. It demands a particular structure. I think it demands a certain aesthetic in order for the story to carry its energy from the one telling it or enacting it to the one viewing it or reading it. For it locates what has an analogous effect in the audience through the mirroring neurons that allow us as witnesses to participate affectively by analogy. That is, through the mythos that underscores the logos of the drama. The plot's very structure finds an invisible correspondence in the patterns of our own psyche. We are crafted to hear and relate narratives. It's in the very structure of being human that we're narrative beings. In a section entitled The Origin of Poetry and the Growth of Drama, Aristotle observes, speaking generally, the origin of the art of poetry is to be found in two natural causes. For the process of imitation is natural to man from childhood on. Man is differentiated from other animals because he is the most imitative of them. The most imitative, because we know animals imitate all the time. And he learns his first lessons through imitation. And all people find pleasure in imitation. The impulse to imitate is of the instincts. And as Siegel's work, as well as others, would confirm, it is in part neurobiological that gives rise to empathy and compassion through resonance and attunement to the other. As the Greek scholar S.H. Butcher affirms in his classic study of Aristotle's theories of art, that Francis Ferguson cites in his introduction, quote, the praxis, that is the action, that art seeks to reproduce is mainly a psychic energy working outwards. Let me read it again. The praxis, that is the action, that art seeks to reproduce is mainly a psychic energy working outwards. Ferguson adds immediately after that, it may be described metaphorically as the focus or movement of the psyche toward what seems good to it at the moment. Such is the case, I suspect, in our emotional life as well. Now I want to go to an illustration and then I'll pause. What, I ask myself, has been the presence of resentment in certain life circumstances that I've suffered? I'm Irish. We have resentment down pat. We all have graduate degrees in resentment. And if you're Irish Catholic, you probably have a doctorate. What would resentment look like, though, poetically, if I were to give it a voice, a shape, and a form? And I encourage all of you to choose an emotion, doesn't have to be resentment, and allow it to speak from your inside out. In what manner would it appear? What face would it wear if I were to remain faithful to its affective presence in my life? I had read about resentment from a psychoanalytical format, but would it be the same if I offered it an occasion to have its own voice? Here's another risk. The following poem is one response to those questions. And I title this Zone of Resentment. Thick with the sludge of 1,000 wounds, carried in pouches, bags, and a velvet valise, portable, permanent, and more precise than the budding of a cactus in April. The zone of moans and scratches of torn fabric, knees worn to the bone from constant surrender. In the zone of resentment, joy is murdered, disallowed, banished in twilight. The zone harbors contrary energies of a past packed like crushed boxes in a garage whose door must never be opened, never be spoken. Harpoons of past wounds twisted into spirals push out of the hide of horrid memories, corkscrews of pain that ooze the past's permanent pillages. The zone bursts with laborious feats of painful punctures to the heart. But others cannot hear its whispers of pain, so they assume that one's life is absent regrets. Now, I was so surprised at such a turnout in that poem. I can't explain the images any more than I can do justice to the complexity of a dream. But one thing I feel certain about, the images emerged and arranged themselves from the deep recesses of the emotion that can dismember one, steal one's freedom, and leave one hardened and envious. But externally, it may not ever be detected. Inwardly, it can act as a corkscrew of pain that is always present, always spiraling into the flesh of joy to disable contentment and serenity. Resentment has its own face in which it appears in the world. And I think that face is different for each of us. It is not my resentment. It is resentment itself, an archetypal feeling or condition, even a disposition. I think of resentment as a disposition to roil into one's life in an instant. So rather than explicating the poem, which I couldn't do anyhow, I want to recall what happened in its making. It was as if I opened to resentment, not as something to rid myself of, but rather to invite it to be heard for the first time on its own terms. In the process, some hold of this emotion on me was loosened, became less contagious, even less toxic. I have, for whatever worth it may possess, created a mimetic form of resentment. It represents something of the devastating and debilitating sense of resenting someone or something, but it has now acquired an aesthetic face that transcends the mere emotional feeling of resenting some circumstance, some person, or some event in my life. I also sense that in the poem, I have mythologized resentment. It is mine, and yet larger, more universal. The metaphors that visited resentment may have offered this eroding emotion a new energy to be contemplated by readers who can test its veracity off their own experiences of resentment, which I think is what needs to be called up in any of us to compare it. Resentment matters. Let me pause there because the next, so the next section is Mimesis, Beauty, and Justice. Maybe I'll go on for just a bit longer, but then stop. Let me go for 10 minutes, which will take us about 10 to 7 your time. Because I'd like to, if nothing else, to touch on this connection between beauty and justice. A final and extremely helpful voice to round out this topic is Elaine Scarry. I don't know if her last name, and if somebody knows, tell me. Her name is S-C-A-R-R-Y. I don't know if it's Scarry. I've not heard it pronounced, but I'm going to use Scarry. I don't want to use scary. No, let's stay with Scarry. In her elegant little book that I can't recommend enough, entitled On Beauty and Being Just, which contains crucial insights into the mimetic mode, learning, and aesthetics. Her keen views on the nature of beauty are not unrelated to either Aristotle or Siegel's discoveries cited earlier. Beauty, she writes in an early meditation, brings copies of itself into the world. It makes us draw, take photographs of it, or describe it to other people. Those are her words, which is what I wish to express of my own experience of being in tune with the closing of the day or entering the grieving circle of the woman whose loss of her pet profoundly altered her life, or establishing a new relationship with resentment. All of these comprise experiences that are both aesthetic and mimetic in nature. Slattery continues in observing that beauty, this is her language, sometimes gives rise to exact replication and other times to resemblances, and still other times to things whose connection to the original site of inspiration is unrecognizable. So 3 tiers of the forms of expression. From her insights, I include the following. I want to share 4 of these with you that came out of my meditating on her book. 1, a sense of abundance attends beauty's presence. There's not stinginess, there's not scarcity in the presence of beauty. 2, beauty affords or makes possible a moment of largesse, which may take the form of compassion through a suffering with. 3, beauty can issue in forgiveness. In the moment of beauty's presence, I sense an opportunity to forgive myself and to forgive others. And 4, in the presence of beauty, wounds can heal, or at least close a bit further than they had previously been allowed or even invited to. Now, I understand her discussion of beauty's qualities above to point to some action of seeking resemblance or mirroring, and to move into attunement or in some accord with the beautiful. Here she taps, I think, one of the well springs of mimesis. That is, the desire or impulse or energy that gathers around an aesthetic experience that nudges one to discover, to create, or to invent in order to draw one deeper into the beautiful, and certainly, or most probably, into oneself. Beauty, as I understand her insights, would seem to prompt in me what I call a quiet energy of fortitude, even courage. It also incites a poiesis, a making or an actively imagined shaping to create an analogy of the object or a simulacrum of the relationship of my experience with the beautiful. I think that was an unconscious, but maybe more conscious motivation 8.5, 9 years ago when I took the invitation of a former student who's quite an accomplished painter in acrylics to begin taking a beginning class in painting with her. And it changed me profoundly to move from words to painting images. Perhaps we need moments of aesthetic presence to align or realign our courage to be and to do rather than to have. Aesthesis does not provoke desire for possession, but is instead an impulse to promulgation. Aesthesis, I think, is a call in the soul for abundance and for that abundance to be shared. Moreover, as she observes, beauty's elasticity has the capacity to hurl us both forward and back. Quote, requiring us, she writes, to break new ground, to risk something, I'm adding that, and back to her language, but obliging us also to bridge back to still earlier ancient ground is a model for the pliancy and lability of consciousness in education. How can we have education without aesthetics? It makes no sense to me. And I'm going to finish this paragraph and stop. Now, these elastic qualities of pliancy and mutability are the necessary ground, it seems to me, for transforming something of ourselves into another level of resiliency, of malleability and give, so that we give, and all of the implications of that word, of giving, yielding, but also giving over. Beauty aids us in avoiding an arthritic sensibility, where our movements can become too narrow and far too restricted. I believe this is the stuff and stature of compassion, a willingness and an openness to be softened, or to be reshaped, or to be reformed and remade within the architecture of unfamiliar ground, not in the familiar, as Ishmael experienced in the presence of Queequeg earlier, and that I felt deeply in front of the color-laden woman who related to me the loss of her pet. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I'd like to have time here for you to make any observations on any part of that or the last part, whatever you'd like to speak. I love the set of observations that came up a while ago. So.
Well, Dennis, one of the things that I observed in your talk that really resonated with me was the way in which you talked about the calcification and the hardening of both the ideas and the image and all of that kind of thing. And we're seeing today a real wisdom in men softening their patriarchy of their own minds and becoming more nurturing, more receptive, more, all of the things that make us more able to serve in community, serve in relation. And so what you're saying really resonates with me. It just, you know, my good friend Gard Jameson was interviewed on this Compassionate Male program by a fellow named Boykin, and he's going to come with us in December. But this is something like with the work of Sam Keen and Michael Mead and Robert Bly and what have you, has really kind of, it came into vogue in the 80s and 90s, but we don't hear much about softening of males or softening of the psyche. And the psyche is at its best to me when it really lacks form, when it doesn't have the specificity of the idea riveting it to reality.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, Dana. And that for me is where an organic, pliant, malleable myth calcifies into ideology, fixation. And so there is a myth. I think ideologies were at one point organic mythologies that hardened, encrusted, and the blood was drained from it. So, yeah, thank you for that.
We're getting back to our references of the natural world, where the world that we have chosen to inhabit as a species became the world of the mind rather than the heart. And so we developed these head concepts, these ways of things that we thought we could control and that would take us someplace, and the mind became a vehicle to do that. And it has served a lot of very useful purposes. I mean, we've invented language, we've invented the ways of our politics and all of those kinds of things.
Right.
But maybe the head as a structural device has kind of run its course. I mean, maybe it's outlived its usefulness, and maybe what we ought to do is figure out ways to integrate the heart into a way of being. Because before the head became a conceptual navigational tool, the heart seemed to serve quite fine. And we learn an awful lot from heartfelt. I mean, if you look at the words of deep emotions, we talk about something being heartfelt or heart-driven or driven by the feelings and all of those kinds of things. And while that may not be the tool of the business world, it is the world of the soul. And Hillman talks about letting all of these forces, all of these different archetypes, all of the people in our world have a voice. And we don't really want to privilege one of them, like the mind's rational processes, over the body's emotional and the body's processes.
Yeah. And Dara was reminding us not to be too quick to exclude certain parts that have to be dealt with, have to be confronted, but not just confronted, have to be companioned in some way and integrated in some way, because they carry energies that are, I think, of tremendous value. And so as soon as we start excluding, those are energy pockets that can serve us, and we can serve them in a fuller sense of being a human being. So, yeah.
Actually, John,
yes,
hopefully we can hear from him.
Dennis, one last thing.
Yeah, John.
It was so much earlier in your presentation that I hesitate to bring it up again, but I was really fascinated by the discussion about mirror neurons and story, and how our brains are designed for story. As you know, that's my area of love and study and passion. It kept reminding me, the fact that we kept going back to Aristotle's Poetics, and Aristotle, giving us that stories have the three parts: the beginning, the middle, the end, and then connecting that, to what is above, what is here now, and what is below. These three areas. And then I can't help but feel like, as much as I want to make these things linear and make these things what has been, what is now, and what is to come, that's just not, that's not true to the nature of myth. All of these things are happening all at the same time. The cycle is running in each one constantly. And the discussion on mirror neurons, it really just opened up some new ways of thinking about story for me, especially in this time where I'm so focused on time, and I have more time than ever and less time than ever.
Right.
That was just really rich. I really appreciated you going there with the discussion on mirror neurons.
Thank you, John. I want to read more on it, but be cautious around it, because I think, as I mentioned, it could be a vortex to pull us perhaps away from the imaginal. I may not be being fair to it, but just to be conscious of what its boundaries are. And Siegel seems to be a really reasoned person in what he sees as the possibilities, but I also sense that he senses limits around it too. But when I came on the term, I thought, now wait, this is something, at least get some scratchy sense of what it's about. Yeah.
You know, I just am tempted to chime in on that. You know, I always teach mirror neurons as a jumping off point for archetypal studies and that kind of stuff. But I think what you're saying is really relevant because it is still scientific. It is still answering a question of how and not why. It's still in a different place than poesis. And anytime you find a system that's so close to what you're trying to poetically engage, there's a seductive risk that you'll fall into a reductive scientific modality out of that poetic space. And so it gives us great patterns, helps us think about it. But I think you made a great point that we don't want to fall into neurology as a religion.
Right, as a new mythology. But it's part of the developing myth. I just think we want to modulate it, but not suffocate it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Dennis, this is a really good place to bring it to a close.
Yes.
Do you have any parting shots across the bow of mythology? You know, or should we just wrap it and let people watch what we come up with, and we'll see everybody next time? What is your choice?
Yeah, you know, I remember when Campbell was asked in some context that I can't recall, what is mythology? And his knee-jerk response was other people's religion. I think that's worth hanging on to. And then what is somebody's religion? Well, it's their misunderstood politics, history, and he listed a whole series. Now, he was being the impish Irishman there in responding, but it was saying something serious at the same time. That myth carries that energy of religion. The danger for me is belief systems can ostracize more than they allow to be included. So it's being mindful. I mean, to go back to Siegel's mindful brain. And I just want to thank all of you participants in panel for showing up. And I think that the conversation around reading as a kind of archetypal activity might prove interesting for you. So I hope to see all of you for class 5 in 2 weeks. Yeah, and thank you for tonight.
Well, fabulous, Dennis. And thank you all for coming.
Absolutely.
Into another session of Dennis's talks. This has been another wonderful experience. I think what it really points to is the fact that we have a community, and if we put enough of us together in a communal space, we come up with an interesting time. And we say some things that are discovered. We don't know what we're going to say at the time. And the next thing you know, something profound gets to come out.
Oh.
I thank all of my fellow panelists, Kwame, Dara, Will, John, and of course, Dennis. This is just another exquisite afternoon out here. It's evening down there. We're going to keep you up past your bedtime yet, Dennis.
It's all right. Well worth it, because now I'm energized and I won't fall asleep until about 11:30. But it's all good.
It's all good. This is wonderful.
Good.
So until next time, we got a couple more weeks. Then we have number 5, and then we'll see what kind of a sales pitch we can put with Dennis. See if we can get him out here a little bit more.
See where we go. Thank you, Dana.
Thank you,
and
everyone.
Will, and all of you. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
And love out there.
Yes.